Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're stepping into something extraordinary, a castle, but not the kind you're picturing. This isn't your typical fairy tale fortress with soaring towers and grand welcomes. No, we're talking about something far more interesting, something drafty, full of echoing footsteps, and governed by rules that seem completely absurd until you actually live under them. The moment you arrive, you'll be ducking under low doorways, sidestepping ancient chamber pots, and tiptoeing past rooms that clearly weren't constructed with anyone's comfort in mind. But here's what you need to understand. Every single weird quirk, every odd design choice, every corner that doesn't quite make sense, it all served a purpose. And not just any purpose. These were clever ones. You won't believe some of this stuff. Even the staircase, it's essentially judging your sword skills. Before we go too much further, do me a favor and hit that like button if you're feeling this. Subscribe if your heart says it's the right move. And hey, drop your location and local time in those comments. I genuinely love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Get the lights low. Turn on a fan if you got one. We need those background vibes. Let's settle in for tonight's adventure together. You're approaching the castle gate right now. Picture it, a thick wall of oak, reinforced with black iron studs that gleam dully in whatever light's available. You'd expect a grand open drawbridge, something impressive and welcoming. Instead, they direct you toward a cramped side entrance. It's low, narrow, and awkwardly tucked behind a corner. You have to squeeze through, and when you do, another surprise hits you. The wall makes an abrupt turn, then another, and another after that. You're not actually inside the castle proper yet. What you've entered is a funnel, a series of sharp angles and bottlenecks with walls pressing in on every side. It feels frustrating, almost like a mistake, until the realization clicks into place. You've just walked through what's called a murder zone. That postern gate, the side door they sent you through, it wasn't designed to welcome guests. Far from it. The real purpose was purely defensive. Picture this scenario. You're an invading soldier. The postern forces you to abandon any military formation you had going. Single file becomes mandatory. You stumble into this narrow corridor, basically blind, and above you, archers are positioned perfectly. They're aiming straight down through gaps in the ceiling, specifically designed for this purpose. Look up and you'll spot them. Murder holes! Innocent name for something sinister. From these openings, defenders could pour boiling oil down on attackers. They could drop stones. They could drop things even nastier. You look up now and realize you're not even close to the main hall yet. You've just grasped something fundamental. Castles weren't about luxury. They were about survival. That meant engineering every entrance, every hallway, every single courtyard to accomplish two things: slow down intruders and confuse anyone bold enough to push forward. You move into the courtyard, and another oddity strikes you immediately. Those massive wooden doors you were expecting, the ones that should swing open dramatically like you're entering heaven itself, they're barely used. Instead, people flow through zigzagging paths, side passages, and weirdly angled portcullis gates. The whole layout feels intentionally annoying, and that was absolutely the idea. The main gate functioned as a trap. Once it opened, enemy forces could theoretically rush in. So it was used sparingly. Most of the time it stayed closed, usually secured with chains. Even the drawbridge didn't stay down constantly. Instead, Castle residents came and went like sneaky squirrels through back doors, spiral passages, and hidden gatehouses. You pause at a turning point in the wall. The stone juts out, creating a blind corner. This isn't bad design at all. It's a brilliant tactical move. Defenders could position themselves behind those stone projections and ambush attackers when they came around. Some castles even incorporated false doors into their design, completely useless openings that were intended to trick invaders into dead ends. Here's something that really shows how calculated everything was. Some gates opened inward instead of outward. Why would they do that? Because a battering ram couldn't push in something that was bolted from the inside. You'd need to pull it. And you know how many siege engines of that era were built to pull? Basically none. Think about that for a second. Something as simple as which direction a door swings could literally determine whether a kingdom survived or fell. The next time someone complains that old buildings don't make any sense, remember everything we've just walked through. Every curve, every crack, every creaky hinge. There's a real possibility that at some point, one of those features saved somebody's life. You're still standing near the main entrance, and already this place is playing games with your sense of direction. The gatehouse looms behind you like a stone throat, ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to rush in without thinking. When you glance backward, something unsettling becomes clear. From the outside, it looks straightforward, like you could just walk straight in. From where you're standing now, it's a maze. Corners everywhere, bars blocking certain routes, shadows where you can't quite see. The castle didn't invite you in. It tested you. You walk forward a few more steps and stop beneath a dark opening in the ceiling. Your instinct is to flinch, which tells you something important. Even after centuries have passed, your body understands what your mind hasn't quite caught up to yet. This is a kill zone. Above you runs a narrow opening, just wide enough for a bucket, a boiling pot, or a sack of rocks to come straight down. In real siege situations, defenders didn't rely only on swords and hand-to-hand combat. They deployed gravity, fire, and terror, and not always the clean varieties. Sometimes that _0_ everyone talks about was actually hot sand. It stuck to armor, it burned through cloth, and it kept burning long after you might want it to stop. You shuffle forward and notice something about the floor. It sloped slightly upward. Annoying, right? Except it wasn't an accident or a result of the building settling over time. That incline served a purpose. Attackers would get tired faster, their feet slipping as they charged forward. Meanwhile, defenders held the advantage. They stood higher, breathed easier, and swung their weapons downward, physics working in their favor. Suddenly, you understand something important about how castles worked. They weren't built to look impressive. They were built to weigh you down, to tire you out, to make you make mistakes. You reach another turn. This one is awkward, too tight, oddly angled. You bump a shoulder against stone and mutter something under your breath. That irritation isn't accidental. Those corners were measured carefully. In some castles, they spaced them just far enough apart to break up spear formations. Invaders couldn't march shoulder to shoulder like they normally would. They had to twist, stagger, and separate. That's when defenders picked them off one by one. Now here's a detail that might surprise you. Some castles actually built doors that were slightly too short for an adult man to walk through comfortably. Anyone entering had to bow or duck down, and not out of respect. It was calculated vulnerability. In that half second, while a person bent down, they couldn't swing a sword effectively. They couldn't raise a shield. It was a small window, but castles were built to exploit those small windows. You start to feel watched. Looking up again, you catch something that doesn't belong to the stonework. A thin rope. It vanishes upward into a dark hole above the archway. This wasn't decorative. In many castles, bells and ropes near entrances were rigged as alarm systems. Pull one and somewhere deep inside, a warning rang out. A peaceful moment became armor-clanging chaos in seconds. Some gatehouses even had secret peep openings, hidden behind carvings or architectural elements like beams. Guards could observe everything without being seen. If you think you'd notice these openings, you'd probably be wrong. The medieval builders were masters at hiding things in plain sight. False wood panels, uneven stone, decorative ridges, everything could serve double duty as a disguise. And here comes the strangest part. Not every gatehouse was actually meant to be successfully defended. Some were deliberately designed to fail. Certain castles had outer gates that looked sturdy, but were intentionally weaker than the gates behind them. Why would they do this? Psychology. If attackers broke through too easily, they moved forward, confident and reckless, making noise, moving without caution. Then they'd get funneled into the narrow passage beyond where the real defenses waited. The castle let them believe they were winning. A medieval version of, "Come in, we've been expecting you." You pause, listening. The wind whistles through stone cracks like the castle is breathing. You remember the zigzag walls from the last section and can't help but feel something new welling up inside. Not frustration anymore, respect. Those annoying design flaws. They were battlefield wisdom literally written in stone. And suddenly, you're not irritated, you're genuinely grateful. Finally, you step deeper into the castle's inner layers, leaving behind that booby-trapped gatehouse and its confusing corridors. The chill in the air becomes noticeably thicker. Stone walls rise on either side of you like massive cliffs. Somewhere far overhead, a crow croaks from a tower window so narrow it's barely wider than your hand. You crane your neck upward. Is that really even a window? You squint, trying to understand. It's barely more than a vertical slit, so narrow you couldn't wiggle a finger through it sideways. And yet, there it is, cut clean through thick stone, angled downward toward the grounds outside. More of them dot the castle walls in a repeating pattern, dozens of them. At first, you might think they're for ventilation, maybe primitive light sources, not quite. What you're looking at is called a loophole. Yes, that's the actual term. You crouch near one on the lower wall and peer inside. From the outside, you'd never guess a fully grown man could stand behind this slit. But from your angle, the genius becomes obvious. The inside of the loophole flares outward like a funnel. A soldier standing there had full freedom of movement. They could fire an arrow left, right, up, down, total range of motion. But from the outside, all an attacker sees is a vertical slit barely big enough to tempt a sparrow. These weren't just clever, they were absolutely lethal. Imagine trying to attack this castle from the field below. Dozens of arrows whistle down through slits you can't aim back at. You never see the archer's face, only the arrow shaft, and the cold silence after it finds its target. But the design goes deeper than just creating openings. These slits weren't placed randomly. Some loopholes were aligned just slightly off-center, angled to cover blind spots. Others were built low to the ground, designed not for longbows, but for crossbows aimed at kneecaps and ankles, targeting the weaknesses in armor. There's even historical record of one French castle with a special loophole built into the latrine wall. And yes, someone could relieve themselves and still fire an arrow if the alarm sounded. Castles didn't waste space, and they definitely didn't waste bodily functions. As you walk along the hallway, you notice sunlight streaming through one of the larger slits, hitting the opposite wall. It's not a lot of light, barely enough to read by if you really concentrated. But that was the whole point. These openings weren't meant to brighten your day, they were meant to protect it. During cold months, the tiny windows trapped heat inside. In warmer months, they limited how many birds or bats could fly in. They were storm-proof, nearly wind-proof, and completely impossible to crawl through. And just in case someone got desperate ideas about trying, defenders had the height advantage. But what if you needed to get out? Well, some loopholes were built deceptively large, larger than they initially appeared. When things got desperate, messengers and even children could wiggle through and slip into the darkness outside. There's one story, possibly apocryphal, of a young kitchen boy in a Welsh castle who actually escaped through a loop window no wider than a helmet. He carried with him a message that supposedly saved the entire fortress. 2 days later, he was rewarded with a single room and 2 chickens. Not bad compensation for someone who used the window backwards, if you think about it. And then there's the matter of sound. Have you noticed how quiet everything's become? Loop windows didn't let in much noise. That was completely intentional. Castles were designed to keep sound from traveling too far, so you couldn't hear whispers from the next room over or hear cries for help echoing down passageways. Every slit, every angle, every thickness of stone played a specific role in controlling what passed through. Light, arrows, people, even secrets. You run your hand along the cool edge of the stone. It's smooth on the inside but rough-jacketed on the outside. It's a warning. Don't come in. You follow the corridor toward a corner tower. The wall grows even thicker here, nearly double what it was before. At first, it seems like overkill, but then something odd strikes you. The loopholes here are wider at the bottom. You lean down, testing the angle. These weren't designed for archers. These were for pouring. From these larger slits, defenders could dump anything on enemies positioned directly below. Scalding water, burning oil, spoiled meat. Buckets of quicklime meant to blind, choke, or absolutely terrify invaders climbing the walls. In some castles, they mixed ash with lard to create this sludge that stuck to armor and made even scaling ladders a death sentence. If they ran out of that supply, well, chamber pots weren't just for privacy. You step back from the slit, genuinely grateful it's empty now. But understanding begins to dawn on you. These windows were multi-layered. They weren't just architectural decorations, they were tools, weapons, escape hatches, even weather gauges. Some castle loopholes actually had grooves worn into their ledges from centuries of rainwater dripping down. Guards would watch those water streaks to track the changing seasons. You wander into a smaller room, an archer's post. Judging by the dozen tiny slits surrounding it, it's incredibly cramped, dark, barely wide enough for one person to stand. Yet from this single space, a lone guard could cover 3 different angles of approach. That's when you notice the floor. It dips slightly in the center with a hole leading straight down. Not another toilet. This was drainage for blood. During sieges, these posts became actual battlegrounds. The narrow slits forced soldiers to stand still for hours, firing, ducking, reloading. If they got wounded here, there wasn't time to carry them out for medical attention, so the floors were sloped deliberately. The holes let everything drain downward. Cold efficiency, no waste, no hesitation. Part 2. Private Chambers and the Architecture of Secrets. You're finally led to your chamber, or at least what they call one. You have to duck under a lintel that feels a little too low. Another reminder that you need to stay humble here. You find yourself inside a narrow stone room. Wooden beam ceiling. A single flickering candle provides the only light, and something in the corner that loosely claims to be a bed. But wait, where's the bathroom? You ask the servant showing you round. She gives you a look suggesting you've asked something uncomfortably modern. She points at a square stone projection halfway up the outer wall. It looks like a crude bench built right into the wall itself, with a hole in the middle and a tiny stone chute leading directly outside. Meet the garderobe, no chamber pot, no flushing system, just a hole carved into solid stone, jutting out beyond the castle wall where gravity handles the rest. You approach it carefully, hearing the faint echo of wind whistling through the shaft far below. Whatever goes in splashes onto the side of the building or down into the castle's cesspit. If you're lucky, the castle has a moat. If not, someone eventually has to shovel it. And yes, it's completely open to the elements. Winter? It's frigid. Stormy weather? Gusts of cold air can whoosh right up that chute and greet your most vulnerable parts. But in its own twisted way, the garderobe worked efficiently. Waste exited the building. That meant fewer bad smells lingering inside. You sit cautiously on the edge. Then something tickles your leg. Not a mouse. Straw. The floor is covered in rushes mixed with dried herbs. Lavender, mint, sometimes wormwood. Not just for fragrance. They genuinely were meant to ward off fleas and lice. Unfortunately, they didn't always work. Fleas were simply part of medieval life. Your personal items probably came with a few stowaways of their own. The garderobe has another surprise, though. Inside that wall cavity, there's often a shelf or hole nearby. Not for toilet paper, which didn't exist, but for storing clothes. This sounds bizarre, right? Why would you keep garments next to human waste? The answer is surprisingly practical. The ammonia-rich fumes rising from the chute were believed to kill moths and parasites living in cloth. In other words, it was the medieval version of a closet with built-in fumigation. Still feel like changing in there? You notice something else. No lock on the door, just a latch on the outside. Not uncommon. Servants could lock you in if necessary, or accidentally forget to unlock you out. A few castles actually had garderobe chambers that doubled as prison cells. For minor offenses, you got stuck in there for a few hours. Major ones, overnight. It was called a punishment of stink. Don't think you're safe from danger while sitting either. There are actual historical accounts of invaders sneaking up through garderobe chutes. Slippery, disgusting, but technically a way in. Some castles started lining their shafts with iron spikes or barbed grates because of this. One chronicler mentions a would-be assassin who got stuck halfway through and had to be yanked out by his feet. He lived, but his humiliation was permanent. That image sticks with you now as you glance nervously at the narrow hole beneath your seat. This isn't just a toilet, it's a battleground. You step back from the garderobe, suddenly aware of how exposed you feel. There's no privacy curtain, no soundproofing. The drafty stone walls echo everything. In some castles, multiple garderobe chambers were arranged side by side. Yes, communal style. Lords, ladies, and servants alike often shared space during nature's calls. The idea of dignity? That was a luxury reserved for solitude, not for sanitation. And yet, in all its roughness, there was logic operating. With chamber pots, waste had to be carried out manually. That meant hauling sloshing contents downstairs and across halls. Slip up, and the results weren't just unpleasant, they were a legitimate health hazard. Garderobes cut that risk by literally funneling danger out of the household. This wasn't just practical thinking, it was hierarchy. Look closely at castle blueprints, and the garderobe location reveals a lot about who held power. The lord's private latrine might be tucked into a turret wall with a scenic view. Meanwhile, servants used a crude bench overhanging the cesspit. Placement was a statement. You wander down the corridor, still shaken by your recent adventure. You come upon another stone recess, smaller this time. A wooden board stretches across it. Faint soot stains mark the wall above. Someone calls it a night stool. It's essentially the portable version of your recent experience, meant for use during cold evenings. But it had rules, too. In some households, servants had to carry full night stools down each morning without spilling a drop. They weren't allowed to set them on staircases or ledges, not because of general cleanliness, but because nobles feared poisoners. It was believed that urine could reveal secrets if examined carefully. There were herbalists who swore they could detect if a lord had been poisoned just by the smell. So yes, even your pee had political implications. You turn another corner and find yourself in a long hallway lined with small wooden doors. Servants' quarters, most had no garderobe chambers. Instead, they shared a single communal privy, usually located near the outer wall. During bad weather, when going outside was genuinely unthinkable, there was one more option: the piss pot under the bed. Every room had one. You'd lift the lid, aim carefully, and pray you didn't knock it over in the darkness. Morning cleanup was part of the daily chores. Toss it out a window or down a drain, usually with a warning cry of "Guardy Lou" if you were in a hurry. If you didn't warn anyone, well, accidents happened. Speaking of drains, those were actually quite clever. Many castles had sloped stone channels leading from garderobe chambers down the outer wall or into the moat. Some even diverted water through these channels during storms to flush waste more effectively. In places like Caernarfon or Conwy, you can still see these clever flush systems carved into the actual masonry. And there's the smell. You'd expect to be overwhelmed, but surprisingly, it's not unbearable. The breeze through the wall chutes acts like a natural ventilation system. In fact, that's actually where the word garderobe partly comes from. Guarding the robes, as in protecting clothing from foulness and infestation, not guarding your dignity. You sit by the small window for a moment, watching sunlight filter through. Below the moat glistens. Suddenly, you remember that, yes, you've just flushed something into that very water. And in the medieval world, that same water might be used for washing vegetables or feet. Hygiene operated under a completely different set of rules. You lean your head against the stone and breathe in the musty scent of lime mortar, rushes, and damp linen. You came looking for a bathroom. What you found instead was an entire system, engineered, layered, weirdly elegant, and somehow still deeply human. Part 3. Dining, Hierarchy, and Control. The scent of last night's rushes still clings to your boots as you make your way into the castle's great hall. You haven't eaten since yesterday, and your stomach growls like a caged dog. You imagine a warm bowl of stew waiting near the fire, maybe a hunk of bread, a generous pour of ale, but as you step through the arched entrance, everything stops. No one is touching the food. Dozens of people sit silently on long wooden benches, their eyes locked onto the lord of the castle at the far end of the room. A heavy oak table stretches in front of him, piled high with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates, meat pies, bowls of something steaming, and yet no one dares to lift a spoon, because here food isn't just fuel, it's power. The rule is unspoken, but absolutely absolute. No one eats before the Lord, not the guests, not the steward, not even the chaplain. If the Lord hasn't blessed the meal, or more importantly, tasted it first, everyone waits. It's not about manners, it's about survival. In this age, poisoning isn't rare, it's a legitimate threat, a real concern. That's where the food taster comes in. You glance toward a thin man standing to the side of the dais. He's wearing plain wool. His expression reads as nervous. He's already eaten a bite from each dish, chewed slowly, swallowed dutifully. Now all eyes are on him, watching for the slightest sign. A twitch, a grimace, a collapse. He exhales, he smiles. The feast begins. Plates get passed, spoons clatter, conversation bubbles up. You reach for a chunk of bread, but the man beside you gently taps your wrist. "That's for the dogs," he murmurs. You look again. The trencher in your hand is thick, dry, slightly moldy, on purpose. Trenchers aren't meant to be eaten by humans, at least not during the meal. They soak up the juices and grease from meats and stews, acting as a kind of edible napkin. Once the meal ends, they're either fed to the dogs, given to the poor, or sometimes left out in the sun until they turn hard as clay. Soldiers use them for target practice. You finally get a proper portion of barley stew. It's earthy, warm, with something stringy that might be rabbit. You've just brought the spoon to your lips when a sharp voice from the dais interrupts everything. The Lord has noticed someone serving themselves wine before he received his first cup. Silence. Then comes the punishment. Not death, thankfully, but it's humiliating. The offender is escorted out of the hall muttering apologies. That wasn't overkill. That was protocol. Every single act at the dining table reflected social order. Who sits where, who eats what, who gets second servings. You notice that those seated near the hearth get the tenderest cuts of meat, the ripest fruit. Those near the door, cold turnips and old onions. Every meal came with rules. No elbows on the table, no loud chewing, no using your knife to scratch your back. Yes, it happened frequently enough to warrant a rule. You settle into the rhythm. Eat, wait, listen, watch. But underneath everything, you know this isn't really about food. It's about control. As the meal continues, you begin seeing more of the ritual. This isn't lunch. It's theater. The clink of pewter goblets, the careful carving of roasted fowl, the slow procession of servants, each move choreographed like a courtly dance. All of it centers around the Lord's table. He's not just eating, he's displaying wealth, authority, stability. You catch a glimpse of one particularly golden roast carried in on a wooden board. It looks like swan, not chicken, not goose, swan. Its neck is arched into a regal curl. Feathers plucked, but head left intact. For dramatic effect, it's stuffed with spices you've only heard nobles whisper about. Cinnamon, cloves, even a trace of nutmeg. There's no mistaking the message. I can afford to eat symbols of the crown. But the strangest part comes next. Instead of carving it and sharing slices, the Lord Steward lifts a portion from the bird and hides it under a cloth. You blink. Did he just pocket food during a feast? Turns out, yes. In some castles, the choicest cuts were reserved not for the guests, but for documentation, literally. Food accounting was serious business. Lords would keep portions of grand dishes as proof for the ledger. Stewards were required to log every goose leg and venison haunch that entered and exited the kitchen. Don't be fooled by the laughter around you. At a medieval feast, eating was always public. There were watchers, both official and not. One slip, chewing with your mouth open, speaking over a dish, taking more than your share, could be remembered for days, for years, maybe even passed down as gossip across generations. Even the hand-washing ritual before meals was loaded with meaning. Warm rose water was poured over the hands of honored guests using silver pitchers, not for cleanliness, for show. You, however, had to dip your fingers in a shared bowl. No soap, just hope. You glance toward the end of the table. A younger boy, maybe 10 years old, is kneeling on a cushion, passing bread and salt to his elder. That's not kindness. That's training. Noble sons began learning their future roles right here at the dining table, mimicking the gestures and hierarchies expected of them in adulthood. This meal is as much a classroom as it is a banquet. For servants, the rules were even stricter. Some had to memorize who liked their meat salted, who detested onions, who would rather starve than be served fish on a Friday. Slip up, and you weren't just scolded. You might get reassigned to the stables. Or worse, the garderobe detail you just escaped. By the end of the meal, you're not hungry anymore. You're exhausted. Full, yes, but mentally drained from watching every gesture, every glance. You reach for your goblet one last time, only to pause. The Lord hasn't moved, so you wait. Eventually he stands, wipes his hands on an embroidered cloth, and steps away from the table. That's the cue. The hall erupts into quiet motion. Plates are cleared, leftovers get sorted. Some go to the kitchen, some go to the poorhouse, some go to the dogs. Nothing gets wasted. Even the trenches soaked in meat juice are stacked carefully. A few will be dried and given as alms tomorrow. As you rise and stretch your stiff legs, you realize the truth. Dining in a castle isn't about feeding the body. It's about feeding the hierarchy. And now, with your belly full but your mind exhausted, you understand that every aspect of castle life, every meal, every movement, every rule, is designed to reinforce who holds power and who doesn't. Part 4. Sleep, beds, and the weight of medieval life. You wake the next morning on what was generously called a bed, though it might as well be a sack of crunchy sticks. Your back aches. Your neck is stiff. Your arms itch from something invisible but definitely alive. The fire has long gone cold, and the chamber is cold enough to see your breath in the air. You sit up slowly. Everything cracks with each movement. Then you look down. The mattress beneath you isn't really a mattress at all. It's a rough linen sack stuffed with straw and dried leaves, tied off at the ends like some kind of meat sausage. And it smells old. Not foul exactly, but earthy. Sharp. Like it's absorbed 100 years of sweat, skin, and smoke. You pat the bedding and hear that familiar rustling. Fleas! They were never mentioned when someone showed you the chamber last night, but you suspect they're considered part of the standard furnishing. You scratch at your elbow and wonder if this is why medieval people seem so used to discomfort. Maybe because comfort itself was suspicious. Most castle dwellers, especially the ones without much rank, slept on pallets like this. Some lay directly on cold stone. Others used raised wooden platforms just to avoid the worst of the damp. And forget sheets. If you were lucky, you had one coarse wool blanket. If you were really lucky, somebody had washed it in the sun that week. Your pillow is a cloth bundle filled with more straw or possibly sawdust. It smells like mildew and rosemary. The rosemary was probably added to discourage lice. It didn't work. But here's the strangest thing. For all the discomfort, this setup made genuine sense. Straw was cheap, replaceable, absorbent. People swapped out the stuffing every few weeks, not because they were neat freaks, but because straw eventually breaks down into dust. Dust turned into rot. Rot turned into disease. You swing your legs down to the floor and immediately regret it. The rushes under your feet feel brittle and damp. That's because they were supposed to be changed regularly, too. Not everyone did, though. You step carefully toward the window, which is really just a slit in the wall, and pull aside the hanging cloth meant to keep out the morning chill. It's not glass, just oiled linen stretched tight in a frame, translucent, not transparent. The light it lets in is gray, filtered, almost candle-like. But even that glow feels luxurious after the pitch black of the room. And then it hits you. No candles, no lamps. You slept in total darkness because oil costs money and candles weren't handed out like candy. In some castles, candles were rationed by the inch, literally 1 inch per evening. Blow it out too soon? Too bad. Stay up too late? Your problem. You spot your neighbor down the hall, a tired-looking servant woman wrapping her blanket around her shoulders, heading off toward the hearth room. Her mattress was likely no better than yours. In fact, hers may have been shared because here's the part no one talks about. Most people didn't sleep alone. They couldn't. Beds were shared by siblings, cousins, guards, servants, sometimes even strangers, if space demanded it. Body heat was essential, especially in winter. Your only furnace was another warm person. Modesty was a distant thought compared to the threat of freezing to death in your sleep. And still, they got by. You pull your cloak tighter and shiver. It wasn't just a hard bed, it was a hard world. You shuffle toward the corridor, hugging your arms to your chest. You spot a servant lifting another straw mattress over his shoulder. Dust pours from it like flour from a torn sack. He's headed outside toward the courtyard where beds are aired, beaten with sticks, and laid under the sun like laundry. It's not just for hygiene. It's about chasing out the damp, the rot, the creatures that have moved in over weeks. You follow, curious. You spot a row of mattresses propped up like tombstones. Steam rises faintly from them in the morning air. One is being split open and rested with new straw. Not clean exactly, but newer, slightly less alive. This was the cycle. Strip the bed, beat the bed, stuff the bed, share the bed. You glance over your shoulder at the chambers above and remember something else you heard last night. Important people didn't make their own beds. They had staff. But even so, those beds weren't always private. In many castles, even the lord and lady had attendants sleeping just outside their chamber or inside it. Some nobles appreciated the security. Others actively demanded it. Still others had no choice, because warmth, even for them, was borrowed. You re-enter the castle through a side door and pass what you thought was a pile of rolled carpets in the corner. In daylight, you realize it's bedrolls, dozens of them stacked and tied, marked with soot or colored thread. These belonged to guests or retainers who slept on floors wherever there was space. Their sleeping arrangement depended entirely on favor and rank. Well liked? You might sleep in the hall near the fire. Not well liked? You might get assigned the drafty stairwell. In some cases, you slept outside the great chamber doors like a loyal hound. Your reward for this honor was proximity. Nothing more. And yet, for all the hardship, there was structure, a kind of quiet order to the discomfort. There were even rules for when you slept. Castle life followed rhythms of labor and sunlight. You rose before dawn if you were a cook, a stable hand, or anyone tending animals. You rose later if you were a clerk or scribe, and if you were nobility, you might enjoy a brief lie-in unless a hunt was planned or a feast demanded your presence. Regardless of rank, the night wasn't always one long sleep. Segmented sleep was common. You'd sleep a few hours after dusk, wake around midnight, pray, walk, talk, think, or even visit neighbors. Then back to bed for a second sleep before sunrise. It was natural, expected, deeply embedded in medieval life. And that explains something else, why you keep seeing people napping in corners, not out of laziness, but because sleep happened when it could, between tasks, before the fire burned too low, in the lull after a long march, or while bread baked. Sleep wasn't precious. It was functional. You find your way back to your chamber and notice someone has come through. The rushes have been swept into a neat pile, the linen mattress straightened. A sprig of dried sage has been left on the blanket, not as a gift, as a deterrent for bugs. You lower yourself back onto the straw, not quite ready for the day. You scratch your elbow. A flea jumps. You sigh. Welcome back. Part 5. Staircases as weapons and ramparts as battlegrounds. You're called to the tower stairs just before mid-morning. A guard with a scarred cheek beckons you upward. The moment your foot hits the first step, you feel it. The incline is steeper than it should be. The staircase is tight, claustrophobic even. It coils upward in a tight spiral like a stone corkscrew. Your shoulder brushes the central column. Your outside foot barely fits on the narrow tread. It's awkward, slow. But that's the point. These spiral staircases weren't built for elegance. They were built to confuse you, tire you, and if necessary, kill you. Every step upward favors the right hand of the defender. If you're coming down the stairs, sword in hand, you have the wall at your back and full clearance to swing. But if you're charging up, sword drawn, the central stone column, called the newel, blocks your swing. Your right arm bangs awkwardly against it. You're at a disadvantage before you even reach the top. Now imagine 50 attackers scrambling up in full armor. They're slipping, tripping, swinging into stone. Meanwhile, a handful of defenders calmly cut them down from above. That wasn't just strategy. It was architecture with a body count. You pause to catch your breath after a dozen turns. The steps are uneven in height. Some are slightly deeper, others shallower. Your feet keep adjusting. It's subtle, but it's completely deliberate. That irregularity breaks rhythm, especially if you're running. In panic or haste, a single misstep costs you everything. And then you notice something even stranger. The stairs twist clockwise, always clockwise, almost obsessively so. That wasn't superstition. It was military logic. Since the majority of people were right-handed, A clockwise spiral gave the defender descending the stairs more room to swing. It's a castle's way of saying, you may enter, but not easily and not alive. You resume climbing, and the space narrows further. The walls grow closer. The air turns staler. It's darker here, lit only by the occasional slit window. You press on, feeling a chill. The stones beneath your feet are grooved, worn smooth in the middle, but jagged at the edges. Slipping is easy. Recovering is not. And then you hear it. Footsteps descending. You freeze, your back tight to the wall as two armored guards descend with practiced ease. Their feet land confidently. They know each step. One nods. The other doesn't bother. They barely have to slow. You, on the other hand, must press yourself awkwardly to the inside. Barely enough space to pass. In an actual siege, that moment would have been fatal. You carry on, hyper-aware now of every single step. There's no handrail, just a cold wall on one side and a dizzying drop on the other. Some towers had central columns with holes cut into them for easier arrow fire. Others had stairwells completely without columns, hollow cores. They allowed communication between floors or allowed defenders to drop stones and oil on invaders climbing from below. Yes, some castles built trapdoor spirals. If you didn't know which step was loose or which rung gave way, your climb could end abruptly in a pit of very sharp, very final conclusions. You reach a landing at last. Gasping slightly, you step into a narrow hallway that leads to the ramparts. You glance back at the staircase, twisting downward like a spine. Beautiful, isn't it? But built with malice. You step onto the ramparts and breathe in the open air. The wind cuts across the battlements, tugging at your cloak. You'd rather face the cold than those stairs again. You glance back once more at the tower. Only now, looking down from above, do you see how calculated the layout was. Narrow, dizzying, defensible. But the ingenuity didn't stop there. You follow the walkway along the wall and notice something odd about the spacing of the merlons. Those upright stones in the crenellations. Some gaps are wider, others thinner. At first, you think it's a construction error. It isn't. These were designed with line of sight in mind. A wider opening might let you fire a crossbow. A narrower one gives just enough space to aim a longbow or peek out without exposing your head. The same logic from the spiral staircase follows you here. Visibility and control. You duck beneath a low overhang. Another quirk that looks accidental. You're catching on now. That low ceiling wasn't a mistake. It forces you to bend down. It slows you. Behind it is a choke point just like the staircase. In a real attack, this would be the perfect spot to funnel enemies into single file. And there's something more, something subtle. You stop beside a small recess in the wall. It looks like a cubby, barely large enough for a person to crouch in. But that was the point. These musket nooks, or arrow stations, gave lone defenders places to hide, rest, or ambush. They were carved directly into the walkways and angled for one thing only: surprise. Some even had narrow slits below waist height, designed to allow vertical defense. That's right. If someone scaled the wall, you could jab straight down or dump boiling water from your knees. One castle in southern France reportedly carved dozens of these low slits, jokingly called ankle biters, along its outer curtain wall. You continue along the parapet and spot a circular opening in the floor, a murder hole leading down into the gateway tunnel. You'd seen one from below earlier. Now you're standing above it. You peer in. The drop is sheer, just wide enough to throw down stones. boiling pitch, or even hornets' nests. Yes, real hornets sealed in clay jars and smashed open mid-siege. It's all brilliant, terrifying but brilliant. You crouched near the tower again, feeling the breeze whip your hair back. You glance at the spiral staircase entrance once more. Now that you know what it's doing to your sword arm, you start thinking like a builder. What if someone left-handed tried to fight up that staircase? They'd have the advantage. That's why, in a few rare castles, particularly those owned by known left-handed lords, the staircases actually spiral counterclockwise. It's like the castle was built not just for battle, but for a specific body. Part 6. The kitchen's dangers and the alchemy of fire. You head back inside, retracing your steps carefully. The descent feels just as treacherous. One misplaced foot, and you're a story lower, head first. No wonder people often used ropes or even crawled down when exhausted. At the base, you pass a boy lugging a pail of water up the same steps you just came down. He grunts. He stumbles. He steadies himself. No railing, no pity. That was life here. Everything in the castle, every stone, stair, slit, and shadow, was designed to slow the enemy, protect the few, and train everyone to walk carefully, especially uphill. It's late afternoon now. Smoke curls from a distant chimney as the kitchen begins to wake. You follow your nose toward the scent of meat, onions, wood smoke, and something vaguely burnt. But instead of walking toward the warmth, you're led away from it through a covered passage open to the wind. You shiver as your feet slap against damp stone. Are they making you take the long way? No, this is the way. In castles, the kitchen is rarely near the heart of the home. It's not next to the dining hall. It's not close to the sleeping quarters. It's not even inside the main keep. You round a corner and find it. A low, wide outbuilding, thick-walled, smoky, the castle kitchen, and it's almost outside on purpose. Why? Because fire is not a matter of quote one but quote two. Kitchens were tinderboxes, one overturned pot of grease, one neglected ember, and an entire wing could vanish in flames. So medieval architects learned early. Keep the fire separate. Many castles had kitchens in standalone buildings or distant wings. Some even had multiple in case one went up in smoke. You step inside and are hit with a wall of heat. Sound, chaos. It's alive in here. Enormous hearths line the walls, wide enough to roast a pig whole. Iron pots bubble over open flame. Spits turn slowly with cuts of meat, drizzling fat onto hot coals below. You hear sizzling, coughing, the scrape of ladles against cauldrons. Somewhere, is that a goose? A bird honking indignantly in a basket? The floors are slick. The air chokes with soot. Everyone is moving fast. There's a pecking order, even in this heat. The cook, often male in wealthier castles, rules like a general. His underlings chop, stir, scrub. One woman is assigned to tend nothing but the oven. She doesn't leave its side. Another tends only the fire. Another crushes herbs with a pestle the size of her arm. You're told not to touch anything. And you listen. Fire wasn't just dangerous. It was sacred. It never truly went out. In some kitchens, a bank of embers was kept alive overnight under ashes to rekindle the next morning. Letting it die was a serious offense. In some households, it was considered bad luck. In others, grounds for punishment. And then there's the smoke. You cough, eyes stinging. Why no chimney? Because in many early kitchens, smoke was part of the recipe. It preserved meats. It cured fish. It seasoned the air itself. Ventilation was poor, yes, but deliberate. A smoky kitchen wasn't broken. It was working. You wander to the far end and find a room lined with hooks. Meat hangs in every state of preparation, skinned, salted, strung up to dry. A boy pours brine over something you hope is pork. Another rubs crushed garlic into a split rabbit. Even here there's hierarchy. Salt was precious. Only the senior assistants could measure it. And here's the weirdest part. Many castles had their own recipes for fire. That's right. Specific woods were burned for different effects. Ash for heat, applewood for smoke flavor, pine only for quick boils. Too much resin otherwise. Kitchen logs were recorded, rationed, even locked in storerooms. Because in a world where fire could cook your meal or burn down your legacy, every flame mattered. You moved toward the rear of the kitchen where the air thinned slightly, just enough to breathe. Here, the frenzy quiets into rhythm. A woman kneels by a stone basin, scrubbing vegetables with what looks like a bundle of straw. Potatoes, carrots, leeks. Simple fare, but not always clean. Some still wear flecks of soil. Others seem like they've been peeled with a dagger, which, frankly, they might have been. There's no running water. Instead, barrels stand along the wall, each filled earlier in the day from the castle's main well. Beside them sits a terrifying contraption, a long iron ladle with a hook. That's how cooks fish out water, one scoop at a time. It's slow, heavy, awkward. But there's a reason they don't just walk to the well. Because the kitchen can't burn alone. Even outbuildings posed a threat. If the kitchen caught fire and someone had to run through winding halls and stone doors to fetch water, it would be too late. So water lives inside the kitchen, or more often, under it. Some castles had cisterns built beneath the floor, collecting rainwater from the rooftops above. Not for drinking, goodness knows, but for dousing flames and cleaning pots. And those pots. Massive blackened cauldrons. They're always cooking something, even when no one is eating. Broths were kept simmering day and night. Bones boiled down over hours into stock for the next stew. In a cold stone world where nothing went to waste, this eternal soup was both a necessity and a symbol of security. You spot a curious shelf near the door. It holds not food, but powders, spices, rare and strange, saffron maybe, ginger, even dried orange peel saved from a noble's gift months ago. They're wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked in wooden boxes like treasure because they are treasure. 1 ounce of cloves could buy a sheep. 1 spoonful of cinnamon represents a day's wages. These weren't seasoning, they were status. Only the head cook touched them, only under watchful eyes. A young boy slips past you with a wooden tray. On it, a half-sliced wheel of cheese, a bunch of wilted herbs, a small round loaf, likely headed for someone in favor, a minor lord, a favored scribe. The rest of the castle will eat what's left behind, maybe a pottage of barley and roots, maybe yesterday's bones with today's turnips. And if the food spoiled, it wasn't always thrown out. Some kitchens had tasting dogs. Yes, dogs trained to sniff or nibble meats before servants risked it. In one castle, there's a record of a dog named Bartholomew, who was considered so reliable that his absence was mourned more deeply than a fallen guard. Supposedly, he once barked at a pigeon pie that later made 3 men sick. You lean against the wall, weary from the heat. You realize this kitchen isn't a room. It's a machine, a living, smoky, creaking engine that keeps the whole castle fed, warm, and vaguely sane. But its walls bear scars. Look closely, and you'll find blackened stone where fires once took hold. Scratches on the door where a grease cart overturned. a cracked window from a pot that exploded, all reminders that a kitchen fire was never small. You step back outside into the cold, rubbing your eyes as the light stings. Behind you, the kitchen roars on, half miracle, half hazard, a place where flame cooked the stew and whispered danger at every turn. Part 7. Mazes, hidden passages, and controlled confusion. As dust settles, the castle seems to grow taller. Its towers loom darker against the sky. You're led back inside through a narrow covered walkway that loops behind the keep. Another strange detour. You follow without question. Now, if this place has taught you anything, it's that odd paths usually mean intentional ones. You pass through an arched door and find yourself in yet another corridor. But this one feels different. The air is tighter. There's a faint echo to your footsteps. Every turn, every new angle throws off your sense of direction. After just a few minutes, you're lost, exactly as planned. Castle architects were masters of controlled confusion. Interior layouts weren't open or intuitive like modern buildings. They were defensive puzzles designed to disorient attackers, slow movement, and force hesitation. What feels like poor planning was, in fact, a tactical advantage. You pause at a three-way intersection, unsure of which path leads to the main hall. One hallway ends in a dead wall. Another curves left with no torches. The last drops downward toward what looks like storage. You could have sworn you just came from that direction, but now it feels completely different. That's by design, too. Many corridors in medieval castles were deliberately built to look identical. Same width, same arch style, same flooring, designed to disorient even the most experienced intruder. And some dead ends weren't dead at all. They held hidden doors, or turned sharply into arrow loops, or doubled back toward courtyards. You try the dim hallway and feel the temperature drop. Here, the stones seem more damp, more ancient. You notice a tiny notch in the floor, just enough to trip someone who's running. Not a mistake, a tripstone. Some castles embedded them every 10 to 12 paces, placed where the light didn't quite reach. And then there's the floor itself. You start noticing it slopes ever so slightly downward. At first, it feels like imagination, but the angle grows with each turn. Suddenly, you're moving faster than intended. Your steps echo louder. You plant your feet carefully now, alert. You've wandered into a kill funnel. These twisting corridors weren't just confusing, they were weapons. In a siege, soldiers might breach an outer wall and rush into what they think is a clear hallway, only to get trapped in a narrowing space. Attacked from above through murder holes, or ambushed from side alcoves where defenders waited unseen. Some walls even had false mortar lines painted or carved into them to mimic secret passageways or hide real ones. And if you think it's paranoid, remember this. One mistake inside a castle could let 50 enemies in. Every wall had to think ahead. You turn a corner and find yourself back at what seems like the start. Only now there's a staircase you hadn't noticed before, a spiral again. You sigh, but this time the stairs go down. Curious, you descend carefully. The stone gets rougher, older. The air dampens. Finally, you reach a narrow underground passage that cuts through the castle's base like a root. There are no windows, just torches fixed in iron brackets. Their flames sputter in the stale air. This is the Sally Port, a secret tunnel meant for escape or surprise attacks. You crouch slightly to pass through. The passage twists twice and ends at a fortified door leading somewhere beyond the walls. It's barred now, but in wartime, this tunnel would have been open to send scouts or flank attackers. And just like that, the confusion becomes clarity. Every odd angle, every twist and turn was never about beauty. It was about advantage. You head back up the narrow stairwell from the sally port, this time with a new awareness. The walls aren't just stone, they're strategy. Every inch of this place was built to steer you, slow you, test you. As you return to the corridor maze above, you notice something new. The light is playing tricks, literally. Several sconces along the walls are unlit. In their place are darker bricks, recessed, not just shadowed. You lean in and realize some are false panels. Others are viewing holes. You can't see through them, but someone on the other side probably can. And that's the unnerving truth of many castles. You're rarely alone. Certain sections of the corridor walls were constructed with listening tubes, small pipes or cracks in the masonry that allowed sound to travel between rooms. Some castles even featured vents disguised as part of the fireplace that fed conversations directly to another chamber. Not ghost stories, just eavesdropping the old-fashioned way, and these weren't just for spying on guests. Lords spied on their own households, their stewards, their heirs. Trust was in short supply. Paranoia wasn't a flaw in a castle, it was a foundation. You find yourself back in the upper levels. Now the layout feels more familiar. You start noticing the hidden architecture, loops in the floor plan where corridors bring you right back to where you started. That wasn't poor design, that was stall time in case of invasion. While attackers ran in circles, defenders took position. Even ceiling height varied for a reason. In some sections, the ceiling drops just low enough to make tall intruders duck and drop their guard. These choke zones forced enemies into bad posture, making them easier to subdue. But defenders, they memorized these routes, trained in them. They knew where to press a stone to trigger a latch, where to flatten against the wall and vanish from sight. In one English castle, a former coal chute was repurposed into an emergency crawl space, wide enough for one, with steps carved straight into the wall. There's even a tale from a Welsh stronghold where a lady of the house escaped through the linen closet, or rather, through the wall behind the linen closet. It led into a priest hole, then down into the kitchen chimney, finally out into the moat's drainage tunnel. Was it true? Who knows? But the stonework shows something used to be there. Part 8. The Queen's Wing and the Power of Secrets. You're summoned again, this time not by the steward, but by a nervous page who refuses to meet your eye. You're to report to the Queen's Wing, he mumbles. You expect a message or an errand. Instead, you're pointed to a spot beneath the central chandelier. A tall one, iron, suspended from the ceiling by a thick rope. It sways slightly when the doors close. You've passed under it before, never thinking much. It hangs over the center of the hall like a halo of flickering light. Today, though, it feels heavier. The chain creaks overhead. Your eyes follow it upward. Then you're handed a bucket of sand, not for cleaning, for fire suppression. Chandeliers in medieval castles were rarely decorative. They were practical, brutal, and occasionally deadly. Many were built with counterweight systems, not just to raise and lower them for lighting candles, but to drop them deliberately. The rope was tied to a beam or wall fixture, often with a quick release. In times of invasion, fire, or betrayal, that massive ring of candles and iron could be unhooked to crash down onto whatever or whoever stood beneath. And what stands beneath the chandelier, the center of power, guests, petitioners, occasionally the Lord himself, a warning, perhaps, that no one, not even the host, was truly safe. You look around and notice something you missed before. The stone directly beneath the chandelier is newer, lighter. It's been replaced. Someone fell or was struck hard enough to crack it. No one talks about it, but the servants know. You glance up again. The wax on the iron has melted unevenly, leaving long black trails like old blood. The candles are trimmed short, too short to burn long, which means they're replaced often. Someone checks them daily, carefully, because nothing up there is left to chance. In fact, chandeliers often served more than one purpose. They lit the room, yes, but they also revealed it. From that high vantage, you could see every movement, every cup lifted, every glance exchanged, every dagger drawn. Some castles even had catwalks above the chandeliers, allowing guards or watchers to observe unseen, and sometimes to intervene. In a French stronghold turned fortress, there's a record of a chandelier designed with hollow candle sockets just wide enough to pour oil through. In a moment of betrayal, guards above could tip fire down upon a traitor below. Legend, maybe? But the iron rings in your own hall look sturdy enough to support the weight of something heavier than wax. You set the bucket down and sweep the floor beneath it, careful not to bump the rope. The chain overhead groans slightly with the weight. You wonder how often someone checks that pulley, how much friction it takes to drop it, whether you could stop it in time. Then you spot another oddity, a small notch in the floor just a few feet away, like a groove worn by repetition. It leads directly beneath the chandelier. It's a target mark. At some point, someone stood there enough times for stone to remember it, and now you're standing there too. You take a cautious step back. That's when it clicks. The light above isn't just to illuminate the room, it's a reminder. You're always under something in a castle. You leave the center of the hall and slip into the shadowed edges, away from the swinging weight above. But now, everywhere you look, you start to wonder what else in this room might fall. Castles weren't subtle when it came to threats. Sometimes the danger was eye level, a sword, a sneer, a poisoned cup. Other times, it hung above you, disguised as warmth and light. And chandeliers weren't the only tools of overhead intimidation. You glance toward the timber beams arching high above the dais. They look decorative, exposed wooden ribs that curve across the ceiling like the skeleton of some ancient beast. But one of them has a notch, a black mark, burned, not carved. A signal fire set centuries ago when a lord was betrayed during a winter feast. According to a servant who talks too much, the beam had been doused in pitch ahead of time. When things went wrong, someone lit it, not as a trap, but as a warning to the rest of the castle. Retreat to the tower. The hall is no longer safe. Yes, even fire had its place in the rule book. You sit on one of the benches near the wall beneath a narrow window. Above you hangs a smaller iron bracket. Another lighting fixture, this one mounted into stone. You think it's just for torchlight, but look closer and you'll see what others miss. Hooks, more than necessary, unevenly placed for a kettle, a curtain, or maybe a cage. In some castles, these hooks were used to hang sconces by day and prisoners by night. Not executions, just humiliation, public shaming, loud enough for dinner guests to hear, close enough for the servants to spit. And in this very hall, near this very wall, there's a discoloration in the flagstone, a faint reddish hue that doesn't match the rest of the floor. Someone once spilled wine, they say, Others aren't so sure. You catch a whisper from the steward later that evening. The story of how this hall once had a false beam, a decorative panel meant to conceal a blade pulled by a rope that could drop like a guillotine. Only once, of course, but once was enough. That feature's long gone now, or hidden better, because even when the threat is gone, the message lingers. That's how castles worked. Power wasn't just something you held in your hand. It was suspended from the ceiling, bolted into walls, etched into floors, constantly visible, constantly unstable, a place where hospitality and menace share the same roof. And the chandelier above, it's still swaying, just slightly, not from wind, but from memory, and perhaps from someone tugging the rope in a distant chamber, checking that everything still works, that the balance is right, that nothing rusted shut. You glance up one more time before you leave. You don't trust it, and that's exactly how the castle wants you to feel. Part 9. Bells, Alarms, and the Architecture of Warning. The bell rings just before midnight, not the soft chime of a chapel service, not the clang of the evening watch. This is sharper, more urgent, a single toll, then silence, then again. The steward doesn't explain. He doesn't need to. You're already moving. In castles, bells weren't for beauty. They weren't even primarily for timekeeping. They were for warning. A single toll meant something was wrong. 2 meant something was happening. 3, don't wait for 3. You race down a corridor with others. A cook still in flour-stained sleeves. A stable boy clutching a lantern. No one speaks. The bell tolls again. And you know this isn't a drill. The hallway leads you past the granary, then curves sharply. Too sharply. Suddenly, you're all funneling into a narrow space, just like the corridors you got lost in before. But this time, they're doing exactly what they were built for, forcing people together. You end up in the lower ward just outside the armory. Others are already gathered. The gate is closed, not because the enemy is outside, because they're inside. Someone's missing from the watch. The bell tolls again. Now the guards are moving, not running, flowing. They slip behind tapestries, vanish into panels. One slides a barrel aside and disappears down a hatch you hadn't noticed earlier. That's when it hits you. The castle's real security system isn't its doors or locks. It's knowledge. Who knows which torch bracket lifts to reveal a stairwell? Who knows which drain pipe echoes differently when knocked? Who knows the sequence of turns to access the hidden spiral inside the curtain wall? And who doesn't? You're herded into a room you've never seen, a cold arched chamber with strange markings on the floor. At first, you think it's some kind of storage. Then you realize there's only one entrance, no windows. The walls slope slightly inward. A heavy iron grate sits on the far side. It's a containment room. You're not being protected from an intruder. You're being separated in case you're the threat. One of the guards speaks briefly. Someone was seen where they shouldn't be. That's all. No names, no accusations. Just waiting now. You glance up and see that the torch above you isn't mounted in the wall. It's hanging from a metal track, which means it can be moved, adjusted, watched. A slow realization creeps in. This room was never meant to make anyone comfortable. It was meant to make them visible, and perhaps more importantly, listenable. Someone coughs. Someone shifts. You hear whispers, then silence. You glance around and realize there's no place to hide, not even in your own expression. It's brilliant and terrifying, because bells in a castle weren't about noise. They were architecture in motion, a signal that woke the entire structure. From the ramparts to the kitchens, Everyone knew what to do, even if they didn't know why. You wait in that chamber for what feels like hours. The bell has stopped, but its echo lingers in your chest like a second heartbeat. Then finally, a knock. 3 short raps. A guard opens the door, not the one you entered through, but another set behind a false wall you hadn't even noticed. Everyone's dismissed without ceremony, no questions answered, no explanations offered. And that's the final lesson of the castle bell. It doesn't explain, it commands. As you step back into the corridor, everything feels just a little more fragile. The walls aren't just stone anymore. They're full of mechanisms. You notice them now. That chain leading upward along the stairwell, not just structural, it's connected to a weighted gate. That flag hanging in the corner. There's no reason for it to be covering that vent unless it hides something else. Every hallway might be listening. Every bell might be a trap. And still the day resumes. You pass the chapel. The bell here is smaller, prettier, more ornate, but still it carries that same ancient weight. This one rings for the canonical hours, matins, lauds, vespers, prayer times technically. But in a castle, even prayer measures control. Some castles even had multiple bells, each with a different tone. One for fire, one for feast, one for storm. And some, reportedly, had bells that were never rung at all, reserved for death alone. The silent bell, they called it, struck only when a lord fell, or a child was stillborn, or something in the household cracked beyond repair. But not all bells are above you. You're sent next to the lower bailey where you pass the stables and smithy. There, near the outer wall, is a rope attached to a bell with no housing, just hanging there, exposed to the elements. This one, you learn, was for alarms raised by the villagers outside. If they spotted raiders, fire, or plague wagons, they'd ring this bell to warn the garrison. Funny thing is, that bell could only be heard inside the gatehouse, nowhere else. If you were sleeping in the Lord's chamber or the West Tower, you wouldn't hear it, because not all warnings were meant for everyone. Castles didn't broadcast panic, they filtered it. Later that night in the kitchen, someone knocks over a stack of pans. You jump. The cook doesn't flinch. "That's not the sound you run for," she says without looking up. "You'll know it when it comes." And that's when you realize the castle's not just stone and rule, it's rhythm. Days marked not by clocks, but by clanging iron. Rolls announced not by speech, but by pitch. Even silence has its meaning, especially silence. The bells don't ask your opinion. They don't warn you for your comfort. They remind you who's in charge. And in a place where danger could come from outside or from across the table, you learn to sleep lightly, move quickly, and always listen for the next sound. Even now, long after the midnight toll fades from the tower, your ears still wait for it, just in case. Part 10. Candles, Fire, and the Supernatural Dimension. By now, you've learned to tread lightly and glance upward. But tonight, as you walk back toward your assigned chamber, you're given one final rule, whispered by a gray-haired laundress as she hands you a candle. "Whatever you do," she says, "don't blow it out." You smile, unsure if she's joking, but her eyes don't waver. In castles, candlelight wasn't just light, it was ritual, rule, protection. You climb the narrow stair to your room. Candle in hand, the flame flickers with each breath, each draft. You cradle it like a living thing in a world without switches, without steady lanterns or gaslight. One small flame might be all that stood between you and the dark. But superstition clung to it like melted wax. In many castles, You weren't allowed to blow out a candle with your breath, not because of fire safety, because of spirits. There was a belief, particularly among servants and lower-born residents, that extinguishing a flame with breath could invite something in, something unseen. Air, after all, was believed to carry more than scent. It carried messages, souls, mischief. To blow out a candle was to chase away the light, and with it the safety of the room. Instead, you were taught to snuff the candle, pinch it with fingers wetted in tallow, or press a metal cone over the flame, quiet, clean, respectful. You reach your chamber and do just that. Letting the small cap of iron smother the glow, darkness swells instantly, deep and thick. You can hear the pop of cooling wax and your own breath, nothing else. But in that silence, you remember something else. Candles weren't personal property. In many castles, they were rationed, not just by household budget, but by inches. A steward might give you a 4-inch candle to last the evening. Once it burned down, that was it. Some households even used candle clocks. Time was measured by how much wax melted. Burn your candle too quickly and your evening was over. Leave it burning when you left the room. That was a punishable offense because flame, while precious, was also dangerous. One gust of wind could tip it. One missed curfew and your bedchamber might become a pyre. Castles were stone, yes, but filled with tinder, rushes, tapestries, old linen, thatch, oak beams cured dry by decades of smoke. Even the chandeliers you feared earlier had to be lit by ladder, pole, or pulley, and every lighting was a calculated risk, which is why most of the time candles weren't placed high. They were placed low on wall sconces, table stands, or iron hooks just above eye level, not for elegance, for containment. And the wax, not the creamy kind you imagine. Tallow was far more common. Rendered animal fat. Pungent and smoky, it dripped, sputtered, attracted insects. But it was cheap. Beeswax was a luxury reserved for the chapel or the Lord's bedchamber. So while the rich slept in golden glow, the rest curled in shadows that stank of mutton grease, and perhaps worse than the smell was the noise. A tallow candle could whisper. When the fat burned unevenly, it produced a soft crackle or hiss, enough to unsettle, enough to make people believe it was speaking. Some said the candles warned you of treachery. Others believed it was the voice of someone watching from beyond. Either way, you didn't blow it out, not with breath, not if you valued sleep. The chamber is cold now. The candle has gone dark, and the room feels different, emptier. You lie on the straw-stuffed mattress, cloak drawn to your chin, eyes open to nothing. You try to convince yourself it's just the wind moaning through the window slit, just the fire in the great hall settling into embers. But that whisper you hear, it might just be your own imagination. Because in a castle, darkness has rules too. You remember now another warning, half heard in the kitchen while peeling turnips. Something about never sleeping with a candle too close to your bed. Not because of fire, because of what you might see. You turn your face toward the wall. In some parts of the castle, particularly the older wings, people swore that candlelight moved on its own, that even after the flame was snuffed, shadows still flickered across walls where no light burned. The servants called them memory lights. Not ghosts exactly, just residue, a warning etched into stone. You try to breathe slowly, calmly. Your eyes adjust. Now you can see the room, the outlines of the wall, the black rectangle of the door. Faint starlight filters through the slit window, silver and quiet. You look toward the small shelf above the hearth, where a second candle stub sits waiting, unlit. You're tempted to light it. But you remember the rule. Once the candle is out, let it rest. That was the saying. You don't relight a snuffed flame. Not unless you want to wake something old. Whether that meant a story, a curse, or just the attention of someone who preferred darkness, no one could say. Still, candles were more than fear. They were signals. A flickering light in a high window might mean welcome. A steady one meant occupied. 3 quick extinguishings in succession. That could be a secret code used between lovers, messengers, or spies. And yes, candles were spies too. You're told of one noble who paid his steward extra to install reflective plates behind the chamber sconces. Not for brightness, for surveillance. Light bends, light reveals. With enough polish, you could see a reflection of someone standing just outside your doorway, or a hand moving toward a letter they weren't supposed to read. There are stories of double-wicked candles crafted to burn twice as fast, used to create urgency or panic. Servants who didn't know better would think hours had passed when in truth it had only been minutes. And then there are black candles, rare, forbidden, usually beeswax mixed with soot or pitch, said to bring dreams or nightmares. No one lights those by accident. You think again of the woman who handed you the taper earlier. She never gave you a candle snuffer, just the candle, as if to say, you'd better already know how this works. So you lie still now, eyes half-lidded, letting the castle fall quiet around you. Somewhere far above, a guard's boots echo across stone. Somewhere deeper, a door creaks closed. But here, in your room, nothing moves. The candle is out, and you follow the rule. And you drift toward sleep, with the understanding that in a place as strange as this, even the smallest light carries tremendous weight. Epilogue. Stone memory and the final understanding. Morning comes with a low knock on the door and a message that makes your stomach tighten. You're to report to the Queen's wing, not the Lord's, not the chapel, not the courtyard or kitchens, the Queen's wing. You've never been summoned there before. You walk carefully. The corridor to her apartments is different from the rest of the castle, longer, quieter, better swept. The rushes smell of lavender, not old straw. The windows are higher, narrower. You can't tell if it's colder or if you just feel colder. At the end of the hall, a door stands open, but no one waits. You hesitate, then enter and realize you've made a mistake. This isn't a bedchamber, it's a trap room, stone walls, one window barred, a wooden chair in the center, and on every side nothing but shadows. There's no sign of the Queen, no tapestries, no scent of rosewater, just old stone and silence. This was never meant for comfort. This was meant for containment. Many medieval castles had such rooms hidden within or near the Queen's quarters, small secure spaces used not for rest, but for watching, listening, isolating. The Queen's apartments weren't just for gowns and letters and harp songs. They were political territory, and as such, they were rigged like a battlefield. You glance at the walls, thicker than elsewhere. One of them sounds hollow when you shift your foot. You step closer. There, a seam, not quite visible, just enough to show a door sealed from the other side. A listening passage. In many castles, the Queen's chambers were surrounded by these narrow walls. Servants, trusted ones, would wait silently in them, ready to report anything heard through cracks, vents, or false grates. You sit on the chair. You've got no orders, no instructions, no idea how long you'll be here. That, too, is part of the design, because The Queen's Wing wasn't just a private residence. It was a courtroom, a negotiation table, a prison, and sometimes a chessboard. In the political world of castles, the Queen's influence was often quiet, but it was never small. And the rooms she moved through, her solar, her dressing room, her withdrawing chamber, were built with this dual purpose in mind: hospitality and control, beauty and surveillance. Some even say the Queen's most trusted ladies-in-waiting didn't just dress her, they watched her, for her against others, sometimes against her. You rise from the chair and inspect the walls again. In one corner sits an old narrow armoire, locked, but on its top dust outlines a circular object that used to sit there, a candlestick perhaps, or something heavier. One theory from a Welsh castle suggests that queens often had weighted candlesticks placed near listening walls, not for reading, but for signaling. 3 knocks on stone, 2 slides, a bump, a message sent from one room to the next without a word spoken. Because the Queen was watched, but she watched back. You step to the door and try the latch. Still locked, not from your side, so you wait. Now you understand this is the Queen's chamber, too. Not the silks and the gold, the silence. The lock finally clicks from the other side. No one enters. The door swings open slowly, revealing not a courtier or a servant, but a hallway you haven't seen before. It curves sharply, lined with nothing but bare stone and the faint scent of rose oil. Someone has walked through recently, someone with power. You follow the passage, shoes soft on worn stone, until it opens into a room that feels gentler, not warmer, but softer somehow. A large hearth flickers. The light falls on a carved wooden screen, a writing desk, and a single high-backed chair turned away from the door. On the far wall, a tapestry flutters in the draught, woven with birds and ivy and something else. Tiny red pages, not a pattern, a message. This is the red page room. You've heard rumors, whispers. Every castle had its own version, some literal, some symbolic. It's not always red ink or crimson parchment. Sometimes it's a private ledger. Sometimes a box of folded slips, sealed and coded, but always it's in the Queen's keeping. Because if the Lord ruled in daylight with guards and banners and garrisons, the Queen ruled in the margins through alliances, through memory, through names recorded and never erased. You approach the desk. There's a sheet of parchment lying on it, weighted by a stone, not sealed, not hidden, but not signed either. It lists names, dates, and a phrase, "Turn their face at the feast." No context, no explanation, but it's enough to send a chill down your spine, because in the medieval world, every gesture meant something. Who bowed, who didn't, who poured the wine first, who sat too close. These were signals as binding as oaths, and the Queen's chamber kept track. As night falls, and you make your way through the castle one final time, everything feels different. You see it now, the brilliance of every strange rule, every odd architectural choice, every inexplicable design. This place wasn't built to welcome you. It was built to test you, contain you, control you, and perhaps most importantly, to remind you that nothing you see is accidental. Every shadow has purpose. Every corner serves a function. Every silence means something. The castle breathes in angles and exhales in misdirection. It doesn't want you to feel welcome. It wants you to feel watched. And as you settle into your bunk for the last time, you understand that you've learned the most important lesson of all. The castles weren't just built for defense. They were built to teach everyone who lived within them. guards, servants, nobles, enemies, children, how to move through the world differently, how to question every surface, how to respect power in all its forms, how to survive in a place where nothing is ever quite what it seems. Extended reflection, the Mason's code and stone memory. Before you fully understand what this place means, you're sent to the lower wing, where you discover something extraordinary. The walls here aren't blank. They're covered in marks, symbols that at first appear random, but gradually reveal themselves to be a language. A mason's mark appears near a support beam. Another shows where a wall once leaked. A cross indicates where someone died. A circle marks a stone that cracked in winter. These markings are the castle's own private history, written in a code that only those who built it can fully read. You stand before these marks with newfound respect. The stonemasons who constructed this fortress weren't just following blueprints. They were encoding instructions for future generations. These marks would tell someone where to check the mortar during spring thaw, which stones might shift under siege stress, where water tends to seep. The castle wasn't built once and left alone. It was a living, communicating thing that spoke to those who knew how to listen. Some of these marks go deeper than practical information. You spot what looks like a blessing, a combination of symbols that doesn't appear anywhere else. It's repeated in 3 places: above the chapel door, near the well, and hidden in the cornerstone of the treasury. What prayer did the masons include? What protection did they believe they were building into the very foundation? You'll never know. But someone, centuries ago, believed enough in this place to literally carve their hopes into stone. In one corner, you find what appears to be a name, just a first name, etched deep into a pillar that would bear tremendous weight, a signature of sorts. This mason wanted to be remembered, wanted future people to know that he had stood exactly where you're standing now and contributed something permanent to this edifice. The thought sends a chill through you. You're touching work done hundreds of years ago by a man whose name you'll never fully know, in a language that speaks silently across centuries. The wells and the castle's lifeblood. Your next task takes you to the wells, and this is where you begin to understand the real vulnerability of a fortified structure. A castle might have impregnable walls, but it needs water. This fundamental requirement creates a vulnerability that builders had to engineer around meticulously. The main well is positioned in the courtyard, but there are backups. Hidden wells deeper in the castle, emergency supplies stored in underground cisterns. The castle planners were obsessed with water security because they knew that in a prolonged siege, thirst would break the defenders' resolve faster than any battering ram. You're shown a well that seems ordinary at first until someone explains what makes it special. The water tastes faintly metallic. When you look down, you can't see the bottom. It's that deep. They tell you stories about this well, how once during a siege lasting weeks, the water level never dropped, how soldiers swore it was blessed. Whether they were right or just grateful for any water source that didn't fail, you can't say. But you understand now that every aspect of castle survival was built into the very structure. Some wells have guards positioned nearby, not to prevent people from drinking, but to watch for tampering. In more than one historical account, enemies have attempted to poison a castle's water supply by dumping dead animals down the well shaft. The smell alone would eventually force people to leave. So castles developed elaborate systems for checking water quality. They used tasting cups made from materials believed to change color if poison was present. They kept sacred fish in some wells, creatures that supposedly could sense contamination through their behavior. The deeper well you visit is carved into solid stone that goes down so far you lose sight of the bottom. A rope with markings burned into it hangs coiled beside it. Those markings indicate depth, water level records kept over decades. You can see years where the marks show less water, years of drought, years where water seems to have been deliberately drawn down, perhaps for rationing during shortages. This well has been maintaining records in its own way, writing history, in rope scorch marks, rooms of purpose, function, and hierarchy. In the upper chambers, you're taken to a section of the castle you've never seen before. The upper chambers reserved for the most important guests and family members. Here, the architecture speaks a different language. The walls are paneled instead of bare stone. The windows, while still strategically positioned, are larger and more numerous. The floors, once you remove your shoes as required, are warm wood that speaks of comfort. But even here, power structures are written into the design. The largest chamber sits at the most defensible point of this wing. It's the Lord's private room, and you notice that it has multiple exits. Should an enemy breach this far into the castle, the Lord could escape through secret doors. The bedroom itself contains an enormous bed, large enough for the Lord and Lady and perhaps trusted servants who provided both warmth and surveillance. A curtain rod above the bed would allow privacy during certain hours. But the positioning of the window means that if an assassin breached the doors, they'd have only moments before an arrow from the courtyard could find them. In the dressing room attached to the primary chamber, you notice something curious. The walls are lined with storage, but one section is distinctly different. When you run your hand along it, you realize that several drawers aren't actually drawers at all. They're false fronts that open to reveal a narrow passage. This passage connects directly to a stairwell that leads down to the stable. The Lord and Lady could, in theory, leave the castle entirely without ever being seen if necessary. The castle was built with its own escape plan literally woven into the walls. The solar, that sunlit chamber, meant for daytime activities, sits in the warmest part of the castle. The south-facing windows provide light and heat throughout the day. But you notice that the light is angled in such a way that anyone looking out the windows can see across nearly the entire courtyard, while someone looking in from outside sees mostly reflections and shadows. The inhabitants of this room could observe everything. They could see the servants preparing food, the guards changing watch, merchants entering the gate, but their activities remained private. It's in this room that you finally understand the true power of the castle's architecture. It wasn't built just to keep enemies out. It was built to allow those inside to observe the world while remaining invisible, to hold complete knowledge of every movement within the walls while maintaining absolute privacy, to control information flow, to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The oral tradition, whispers that shape reality. As your time in the castle continues, you become aware of something that exists outside of the stone architecture entirely. There's a spoken history of the castle, whispered stories that circulate among the servants, the guards, the kitchen staff. These stories are never written down. They live in the collective memory of those who work here, passed from one person to the next. Some are practical warnings. That staircase on the east tower sometimes has a loose step on the seventh landing. The north gate door sticks when it's humid. The west well occasionally tastes of sulfur after heavy rains. But other stories are darker, more mysterious. There's the tale of a lady who disappeared in the east tower years ago. Not violently. She was there one evening, and by morning she was gone. Her chamber was locked from the inside. Her possessions remained, but she was never found. Some say she walked through a hidden door in the wall. Others whisper that the castle itself took her, that the walls, hungry and ancient, claimed her as payment for sheltering so many lives. There's another story about a servant boy who discovered something in the lower tunnels. What he found was never explained, but he emerged changed. He didn't speak for weeks. When he finally began talking again, he had knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. He knew things about the castle's hidden passages that he'd never been shown. He knew about rooms that weren't supposed to exist. Some believed he'd been cursed. Others thought the castle had imparted its secrets directly into his mind, and the shock of that knowledge had nearly broken him. These stories do more than entertain. They establish a shared understanding among the inhabitants that the castle is more than just architecture. It's a living thing with its own will, its own desires, its own way of teaching those who live within it. When you make a mistake and find yourself in the wrong corridor, it's not just geography that's confused you. It's the castle itself, guiding you toward some lesson you need to learn. When something falls from a shelf without apparent reason, it's not simple gravity. It's a warning. The castle is always communicating. You just have to learn to listen. Superstitions and the weight of ritual. As your familiarity with the castle deepens, you become ensnared in the elaborate system of superstitions that governs daily life here. Every doorway requires a specific gesture. You must always enter the chapel with your right foot first. You must never count the stairs. If you lose count, you must start again from the bottom. Shadows should never be allowed to fall on food being prepared for the nobility. Salt spilled in the kitchen must be immediately cleaned up and burned, never merely discarded. These practices might seem like mere superstition, but they serve a purpose. They create structure in a chaotic world. They give people a sense of control. In a place where plague might appear without warning, where a single assassin could change everything, where decisions made in distant chambers might destroy your entire livelihood. Ritual becomes a form of prayer. The repetition of these actions creates a feeling of continuity. Today will be like yesterday. If you perform the same rituals, you will be safe if you follow the rules. But there's another dimension to these practices. They function as a shared language. When everyone performs the same gestures, follows the same taboos, respects the same prohibitions, it creates a community. You're no longer an isolated individual in a vast stone structure. You're part of something larger. You're connected to hundreds, perhaps thousands of people who have performed these exact same rituals over generations. The woman who throws salt into the fire is the descendant of women who threw salt into fires. You're touching history every time you tap the threshold. Some of the rituals have practical origins. The prohibition against women wearing their hair loose in the Great Hall originated from a time when long hair caught fire from candles. The rule about not sitting with your back to a door came from an assassination attempt. The practice of carefully examining gifts before accepting them dates back to a poisoning. Over time, the practical reasons were forgotten, but the rituals remained. And now they feel sacred. They've become part of the castle's identity, the slow corruption of time and stone. On one of your final days in the castle, you're allowed to visit a section that's being slowly dismantled. An old wall that's no longer structurally necessary is being carefully taken apart, stone by stone. You watch as each stone is extracted. Some are marked with mason's marks. Some contain the names of people carved into the surface. Some have dates. Others have symbols you don't recognize, but all of them bear the weight of time. The mortar that holds them is centuries old, turned to dust in places, still hard as iron in others. One stone, when removed, reveals a cavity behind it. Inside is a leather pouch containing coins, old coins from 100 years ago or more, perhaps a mason's savings, perhaps a deliberately hidden cache, perhaps payment that was never collected. No one claims it. The stone is set aside carefully, treated with more respect now that its secret has been revealed. When it's eventually sold for use in another building, you wonder if the new builders will know that this stone carried treasure. Probably not. It will be just another stone. Another section reveals a human skull, just one. No bones, just the skull. It's carefully extracted by the builders, examined and set aside. Was it placed there deliberately? Was it a warning carved into stone? A memento mori? A reminder of mortality? Or did someone die during construction and get accidentally entombed? The castle keeps its secrets. The builders don't speculate. They continue their work, removing stone by stone, revealing and concealing history with each movement. As you watch this process, you realize something profound. The castle isn't permanent. Given enough time, enough weather, enough determined effort, it will come down. The stones that seem eternal are actually just stone. The mortar that feels eternal is just dust and lime. Everything eventually returns to rubble. Yet people build anyway. They carve their names. They hide their treasures. They try to make things that will outlast them. They build castles. Final hours and departure. As your time in the castle draws to a close, you understand that you've been changed by this experience in ways you might not fully grasp for years. You've learned to move through space differently. You're aware now of sight lines, of hidden corners, of the possibility that the wall next to you might be thinner than it appears. You understand that architecture is a language, and castles speak in a dialect of control and power, of beauty concealing danger, of welcome masking surveillance. You've learned that comfort is suspicion, that every rule has a purpose, that chaos and order are two sides of the same coin. You've discovered that the greatest defense isn't walls or weapons. It's knowledge. It's knowing your territory so completely that every foot of space becomes an extension of your will. It's understanding that people can be as much a part of architecture as stone and mortar. You pack the few belongings you came with, your cloak, a bit more worn now, the candle you've learned not to blow out, the memory of 1,000 rules, each one learned through observation or through subtle correction. You take one final walk through the corridors, noticing things you missed before. A torch bracket that serves no purpose except to indicate a passage. A floor tile that's slightly raised, designed to trip anyone running through the darkness. A window positioned at precisely the right angle to show the approach of visitors an hour before they arrive at the gate. When you finally step through the gate for the last time, The drawbridge creaks beneath your feet. You turn to look back at the fortress, silhouetted against the evening sky. It looks exactly as it did when you arrived, every stone in place, every tower standing, every wall perfectly aligned. But you're different. The castle has left its mark on you. It's changed how you see the world. You'll never look at a room the same way again. You'll always notice the exits. You'll always be aware of who might be watching. You'll always remember the rules. And somewhere in the castle, perhaps in a hidden room you never discovered, your name has been carved into stone. Not your birth name, but the name you've earned here. The name given to those who understand that the greatest castles are those built not just in stone, but in the hearts and minds of those who live within them. You were tested, and you survived. The castle found you worthy, and now, forever, you carry a piece of it with you wherever you go. The evening darkens as you walk away. Behind you, torches flicker to life along the battlements. The castle settles into night, ready to teach its next visitor its eternal lessons, ready to whisper its secrets to those willing to listen, ready to show through stone and shadow how power is built, how control is maintained, how history is written into the very walls of the world. You are no longer a visitor. You have become part of the castle's story, and it will continue to whisper through the years, through the centuries, through the minds of all those who dare to understand its language. The castle endures, and it waits.